Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Sunday at the Met. It's one of the museum's long-standing and beloved programs that offer curators and the public alike the opportunities to explore special exhibition and the Met's permanent collections through lectures, conversations, symposia, and more. My name is Emily Braun, and I am the co-curator, along with Elizabeth Cowling, of Cubism and the Trompe tradition. That exhibition, which is currently on view until January 22nd, is transhistorical in its thesis and visual evidence. We show how the three Cubists, Georges Braque, Juan Gris, and Pablo Picasso, emulated and parodied trompe-l'oeil techniques and devices as they dismantled and made us aware of the conventions of Western illusionism. Today's program has special relevance for our profession, curators and scholars. When we began this project some 7 years ago, we did so by involving curators from across the departments at the Metropolitan Museum, drawing on their knowledge and exchanging ideas. Today, you will be treated to a similar experience as we, myself included, will learn from more of the museum's experts, specialists with years of training who study and take care of the objects in the public's trust. We ask them to go back to their respective collections and rethink aspects of trompe-l'oeil after viewing the Cubists' traffic with this venerable art form, one that has undergone changes in reputation, from being valued as the height of virtuoso technique and erudite illusions to being scorned as vulgar entertainment. Their talks give us just a taste and a touch of how artists across different times and cultures and mediums beguiled viewers and collectors with deceptive illusionism. They did so, as we will discover today, by marvelously manipulating different mediums: oil paint, clay, paper, precious stones, glazes, brushes, combs, and so on, for the ability to confound the eye momentarily and tantalize our senses does not depend on mere surface appearances. Artists must take into account all of our expectations about materials, materiality, and scale, and the objects that we confront, gaze upon, and handle in everyday life. Before we turn to today's speakers, I'd like to express our gratitude to Barry and Dee Dee Wigmore of the Barry A. and Dee Dee Wigmore Foundation for making the exhibition Cubism and the Trompe-l'oeil tradition possible. We thank the Gail and Parker Gilbert Fund, the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thaw Charitable Trust, an anonymous foundation, the Diane W. and James E. Burke Fund, and the Janice H. Levin Fund for their additional support. This exhibition is also supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and the Humanities. I will be introducing each of our speakers today individually. And our first, David Pullins, is Associate Curator in the Met's Department of European Paintings, where he is responsible for the art of 17th and 18th century Italy, Spain, and France. His forthcoming book, which derives from his doctoral dissertation, is being published by the Getty Research Institute, and it brings to life the history of painters' studios in the 18th century and the impact of studio practices on questions of authorship, divisions of labor, and the intersection of fine and decorative arts. This April, the Met will open his exhibition, Juan de Pareja, Afro-Hispanic Painter, the first in-depth study of the sitter behind Velázquez's iconic portrait, one of the stars of the museum's collection of European paintings. Dr. Pullins' talk, Panel to Canvas, Portfolio to Frame, Changes in Media in Trompe-l'oeil Painting, considers two key moments in the evolution of trompe-l'oeil that registered changes in how artists and collectors used and viewed new pictorial media. The first is the change around 1500, as artists began to use canvas instead of wood panels for the base or the support of their tempera and oil paintings. The second moment focuses on the 18th century, considering the altered status of works on paper as they became not merely preparatory images, but objects collected and displayed in their own right. In both instances, a historically specific understanding of medium allows us insight into visual games. Many artists' tricks were historically specific, functioning in response to contemporary artistic culture. David?
Thank you, Mimi, and it's a pleasure to be here in the context of such a beautiful and subtle and thought-provoking exhibition. As you've heard, my short talk highlights European paintings at the Met from around 1500 to 1800, a pretty broad span, and it asks how trompe-l'oeil allowed artists and collectors to reflect on changes in medium of the painting itself, to think about what they do in their practice. And this, I hope, reveals a kind of self-reflexivity that the Cubists and modernists, not to mention the present exhibition, have engaged in more explicit ways, but hopefully we'll kind of look at a little bit of how these might be found at earlier moments in time. As you just heard, at 2 moments around 1500 in the shift from panel to canvas is the primary support for most artists painting, and the second in the 18th century when a radically expanded world of works on paper impacted how artists and collectors employed and displayed prints and drawings. I'd like to say that for painters, in a way, these were enormous shifts, smaller versions of something like the revolution in printing presses over the handwritten page. And the sea change at the level of medium are, I'm hoping to show, suggested or registered in trompe-l'oeil painting. So our first example focuses around this work by Leonard, known as Crevelcore. It's one of the earliest surviving independent still lifes in European painting. Of course, you'll recognize it hopefully from the exhibition. It engages a foundational myth in the history of art and representation. According to Pliny the Elder, the painter Zeuxias entered into a pictorial contest by, quote, representing some grapes painted so naturally that the birds flew toward them, end quote. Zeuxias's rival, Parrhasius, meanwhile, exhibited a curtain painted so skillfully that, quote, Zeuxias, elated with the judgment that had been passed upon his work, haughtily demanded that this curtain should be drawn aside to let the picture be seen. Needless to say, the joke was on him. He's humiliated by his rival's masterful depiction of painted cloth. And the story of this contest has often appeared and has a long legacy in paintings of grapes and curtains, some of which you will see in the show. Returning to this work in particular, which engages it but not maybe as directly as those last two, it's insightful to historically situate its extensive attention to and foregrounding of wood panel. This work was made at a moment of transition in Europe between artists typically using wood panel support to preferring canvas, as Crevelcore has done here. This artist actually worked in both media over the course of his life. He switched back and forth. And just to be clear about the photograph, the edges there are bits of frayed canvas. It's not trompe-l'oeil, that's the actual bits of canvas, just so you kind of know what you're looking at. This is it unframed in the studio. Though a clean break between these two kinds of support is impossible to identify, of course. Broadly speaking, while 15th century painters used wood, by the end of the 16th century, most Italian painters were working on canvas. Canvas had many advantages. It was lightweight, eventually cheaper, and responded more easily to fluctuations in temperature and humidity. That's one of the reasons early on it's associated with Venice. In early experiments with textile, a number of kinds were used before oil paints on canvas won out. Here I show you a rare early example at the Met, work on Tuchlein, known as Tuchlein, a fabric support that was applied with distemper, a water-based medium, resulting in this particular matte finish, and was particularly vulnerable to damage. This is kind of a dead-end road in the early moment of oil on canvas. As those early forays indicate, when Crevelcore painted, a textile support wasn't obvious. It was, in fact, arguably a novel thing. This work's early viewers would have been familiar with the graining, crystalline surface, and even comparably far heavier object of holding a panel painting. Crevelcore's play with surface, then, is one that evokes what might be expected of his support. Recalling a past tradition, he moves painting forward while demonstrating his ability with illusionism. Playful engagement with canvas as the support, of course, finds its best iteration in artists who deceive us into seeing the reverse of such an object, a game that relies on our knowledge that canvas has been nailed to stretchers, locked in with wooden keys, and unlike canvas, can be punctured, in this case, playfully by this cat. Crèvecoeur's joke is to gesture to a past tradition while moving forward in this new medium. He seems to allow the wood graining of his painting to show through, as if it were painted on panel, but that ground layer had been left visible. In the late 19th century, Degas, an artist who experimented voraciously with media, produced probably one of my favorite works in the museum, this painting, which approximates what Crèvecoeur seems to pretend to make, a work of art on panel in which the ground or wood graining is deliberately left visible. Finally, simply to emphasize the degree to which Crèvecoeur's faux bois, fake wood illusionism, is not random, an odd, sort of random, irrelevant choice, but has a role of exploring painting as a medium, I think it's worthwhile to consider an object like this that's in the exhibition. It's a completely amazing thing, but it's a very different kind of engagement, I think. It's completely nonsensical in a way in its combination of media. It's a mind puzzle in which the dissonance is what makes it work. That's not to say there's no that's to say there's not, as far as I can tell, a logical relationship between the use of trompe-l'œil here and the medium. It doesn't reflect with any particular nuance on porcelain or wood per se. The relationship of Crèvecoeur's painting to woodworking is underscored by likely inspiration in the trompe-l'œil tradition in Intarsia. This was well established in Italy by 1500. It was typical of sacristy decoration throughout the region in which he lived and worked, and it's very well represented by the studiolo, famous studiolo here at the Met. Intarsia never really fools the eye, of course. You're always aware it's wood, but that's exactly what wows us as we become aware of the technical virtuosity required to achieve such a thing. A format familiar to Crèvecoeur's contemporaries, his pioneering effort to create an independent still life, engages with its narrow depth of field, even the tiny shelf that creates a shallow stage for the presentation of objects. And this relationship is all the stronger, I think, for the band at the top that he includes, presumably another shelf that encloses this little stage set. Shallow depth of field, limited by wooden surfaces, became a mainstay of trompe-l'œil painting, even as it began to explore a host of other questions. This is especially evident in 19th century American works, as we'll be seeing, but is found here in a work attributable to a little-known 17th century French painter, Jean-François de Lamotte. Like Crèvecoeur, the shallow depth of field has established a pretty implausible kind of space, this little shelf, the role of which is far better suited to his pictorial game than it is actually of any use to an artist in a studio. We're presumably looking at artist's studio, but what's the role of this kind of little shelf, if not to just stage the painting? What's particularly remarkable about this painting, though, and what I want to emphasize, are questions of translation between media. This will move us towards the second topic of painters and collectors in relationship to works on paper. Lamotte depicts two palettes loaded with a full range of colors that he's using elsewhere. For both the miniature portrait on copper, presumably, at left, and at right for the small canvas that peels off the faux bois to which it's been penned. This is standard fare for 17th century trompe-l'œil depictions of artist studios, and it replicates explicitly a game that's often played more subtly in artists' self-portraits, such as this you had that preview of, which is the idea of a work in process that essentially plays out for you the very process that has put the object before you. Here in the self-portrait by Lemoine, you see her at work on a canvas, presumably the same process that has resulted in the painting itself. Loaded palettes are relatively common, but Lamotte stages a particular relationship between the painting and a print. Differences between the two suggests that it's a model the painter has aimed to replicate, translating it into color and making choices about scale, inclusions, omissions as per his needs. The caption text on the print does not allow us to identify its author, but this detail inserts tensions about authorship and originality. Lamotte's cross-hatching mimics the metal printing plate that presumably someone else has engraved after yet another person's original. Lamotte and other European artists repeatedly staged juxtapositions of related prints and paintings. In addition to insights into painter's process, such images beg questions about authorship, artistic choices to include one motif, drop another, to remain faithful or deviate. Sometimes they even suggest an uncertain relationship to precedence, which came first, does the painting follow the print, or the print is implied to have come from the painter? In my remaining time, I want to propose how later trompe-l'oeil artists responded to an explosion of printed materials and, in particular, how prints and drawings were being treated by collectors. The explosion of printed materials in everyday life of 18th century Europeans is registered abundantly in works such as these on view in the exhibition. The ephemera of an expanding public sphere, one that was also of great interest to American artists in the 1860s and 19th century more broadly, around newspaper in particular as a kind of through line through the Cubists, of course, as you see in the show. I want to point, however, to a specific subset of works, a flowering of trompe-l'oeil paintings from the 1750s through 1790s, representing drawings and prints framed behind glass. Typically, the glass in such works is depicted as broken or cracked in order to signal its presence and allow for a trompe-l'oeil game of illusion. Until the 18th century, until the early 18th century anyway, collectors typically kept drawings and prints loose in folios or pasted into albums. By the 1730s, however, an industry arose for newly elaborate mounting practices, particularly around a Parisian drawings dealer named Jean-Baptiste Gloomy. As the market and connoisseurial value of drawings as independent works increased and viewing practices shifted around this particular medium. Previously, they're very much associated with workshops and connoisseurship as a kind of secondary realm of collecting and interest. Alongside these developments was the increased and entirely new practice of displaying them behind glass, which protected them from damp, touch, air, dust, dirt. From the 1750s onward in France, sales catalogs and inventories suddenly listed works regularly that listed prints and drawings regularly as sous de glace, under glass, or even agglumi in reference to that dealer who had encouraged this kind of means of display. This was a revolution in how people experienced works on paper. In a sense, they were now being treated as paintings had been. It's useful to see such works as these trompe-l'oeil paintings in their actual frames, the physical three-dimensional frames, which reminds us that as trompe-l'oeil, they require us to think simultaneously of two kinds of medium-specific viewing practices, a long-standing one that had been familiar, and a new one, at least for 18th century viewers who were encountering works on paper hung on the wall. More broadly, of course, they require a cultural phenomenon of framing and glazing that had become normalized. They would have been totally nonsensical a century before, which is why you don't have trompe-l'oeil paintings from the 17th century like this. By the turn of the 19th century, the phenomenon of display was but one of several issues raised in works like this by Boilly, an exceptionally creative and enthusiastic practitioner of trompe-l'oeil. Not only does he include a self-portrait in what seems to be oil on canvas, which is, of course, the actual medium of the entire picture, but he also includes drawings and a range of new print technologies, including so-called crayon manner engravings. You can see them there at left. They respond to this new fashion for buying and displaying drawings by creating cheaper facsimiles that copy the effects of chalk. You can see, hopefully it looks like red chalk there on the left, sort of peeking out from the side, but they actually have plate marks, like the print, because they're a reproducible medium. They require the plate, which impresses into the paper. Many surviving crayon manner prints actually have been trimmed down to the plate mark or are mounted to hide that plate mark in order to disguise them like trompe-l'oeil. And in this way, a cheaper technology could replicate and fool us about more expensive original drawings. Indeed, in theory, Boilly's painting, in this painting, the only original, in theory, objects are the self-portrait, the drawing of the putti's head that includes the artist's lively signature, and presumably maybe some of those works on blue paper at the left. However, Boilly's bravura move is to say, of course, that no, you are before an original, and nothing you see is real except Boilly's own incredible facility in deceiving the eye. Returning trompe-l'oeil paintings to key moments in the history of media, canvas, panel, drawings, and prints, how they were used by artists and seen by collectors can help us to unravel some of the specificity of the games that painters are presenting us with. The fact certain features like canvas and framed drawings are so normalized can otherwise risk us missing just how innovatively painters engaged their own moment. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker, Iris Moon, is Assistant Curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met, where she is responsible for European ceramics and glass. A specialist in the art and history of the French Revolution, she is the author of Luxury After the Terror, great title, published this year by Penn State University Press, and co-editor with Richard Tawes of Time, Media, and Visuality in Post-Revolutionary France, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. Her new book on Wedgwood will be out next year with MIT Press. Now, our current exhibition on Cubism and Trompe-l'oeil offers a tantalizing tidbit in illusionistic decorative arts with 4 pieces of late 18th century Sèvres glazed earthenware, which you just saw an image of, which imitates engravings on paper tacked to mock wood grain paneling. Today, Dr. Moon offers us a larger view onto this subject. Hungry eyes and appetite for trompe-l'oeil in European ceramics and glass. Her talk focuses on trompe-l'oeil ceramic vessels in 17th and 18th century Europe and their use of visual tricks to deceive the mind and whet appetites, increasing our desire as contemporary viewers to know and consume in the process. Iris?
Thank you. When I was first contacted to speak today at Sunday at the Met, I was a bit perplexed. How might trompe-l'oeil actually feature in ceramics? The exhibition, Cubism and the Trompe-l'oeil Tradition, tells us that trompe-l'oeil is, quote, a self-referential art form that calls attention to its own artifice, end quote. It's usually thought of as a technique that plays with the illusionism of flat surfaces. You can see this, for example, in the first painting in the exhibition by the Renaissance Italian painter Antonio Leonelli, whom David just spoke about as well. A cluster of grapes in a bowl and on a vine are set into a wooden shelf. The bird that has just settled onto the bunch of grapes in the bowl, of course, references the famous story told by the ancient Roman writer Pliny the Elder of the competition between 2 painters, Zeuxis and Parrhasius, about who could paint better. Zeuxis thought that he had surely won with the composition of his realistic grapes, painted so well that they had managed to fool the birds that tried to peck at his picture. But when he turned to his rival impatiently, asking to hurry up and see his painting behind the curtain, he soon realized that he had lost, since the curtain, in fact, was an illusion painted by Parrhasius. The tale subsequently became a foundational part of Western art, and the debates about whether art was about artifice, illusion, and deception, or about creating a mirror of nature. I tried hard to think about this ponderous philosophical stuff and how the Renaissance theory of illusion was taken apart, picture plane by picture plane, and playfully questioned by later painters like Georges Braque, Juan Gris, and Pablo Picasso. But while admiring Leonelli's cluster of glistening grapes, all I could think about was my stomach. It was the end of the day, and I was really hungry and thirsty. While standing in front of the painting, my stomach grumbled loudly. But my initial embarrassment turned to curiosity. When so many of the works featured bottles of wine, frothy beer glasses, and tables laden with food, what if it wasn't just the eye, but the stomach too, that was being fooled? And what role might hunger have played in the tricks played by trompe-l'oeil? In the realm of ceramics, vessels sought to fool the hand and the stomach as well as the eye. So for the rest of my talk, I'd like to share some examples of how illusion and trickery played out in vessels made for drink and food. I hope everyone's had lunch, by the way. While these were not always the illusionistic displays of artistry found in trompe-l'oeil painting, they aimed to deceive and to delight, all the while whetting the appetite of the user. It appears that early modern Europeans delighted in drinking games in particular, playing with their vessels, some of which at first glance do not actually resemble drinking cups. For example, this piece here, made in Caen around 1550, at first looks like a man in a hat wearing a pair of unusually hairy trousers. Turn the piece on its side and a handle at the back as well as a rounded vessel shape becomes visible, indicating that it was indeed meant to be held. But the way that this Sturzbecher, or stirrup cup, actually works is by turning it upside down. Known as the bottoms-up cup, such vessels would be filled with beer and offered to travelers, which they would need to empty bottoms up before being able to set the cup down and head out on their journey. Another variation on trick drinking vessels was the puzzle bottle, with a donut-shaped example shown here from France around the 16th to the 17th century, made of glazed earthenware. The trick with this vessel consisted in determining which of the three spouts at the top to use when drinking out of it. The right one would have to be selected and the other two blocked out in order to ensure that the drinker would be able to drink the liquid instead of letting it all spill out. British potters in the 16th century developed a variation on the puzzle bottle known as the fuddling cup. These pieces typically featured multiple containers connected together with entwined handles, which were hollowed out and effectively created one larger connected vessel. Sometimes fuddling cups could have up to 6 vessels connected together, while this particular example at the Met has 3. The term fuddle probably emerged in 16th century England, with the Oxford English Dictionary listing one early usage as, "I'll give thee ale pragmatical indeed, which if thou drink shall fuddle thee hand and foot." Initially, ceramics historians believed that each part of the fuddling cup was filled with a different type of liquor, which the drinker would then have to determine after they had been mixed. However, it's more probable, according to the ceramics historian Michael Archer, that, quote, "the modest size of each individual container was intended to deceive a drinker, unaware of the internal apertures as to the amount of liquor he was consuming." So, this is a quite small piece. It's about this big, so it looks like you're doing a pretty modest portion, but in fact, it's much bigger than you would think. Sometimes puzzle jugs could be accompanied by riddles and rhymes addressed to the user, who was always threatened with the possibility of spilling the drink contained inside. One puzzle jug from Liverpool included instructions. "Here, gentlemen, come try your skill. I'll hold a wager, if you will, that you don't drink this liquor all without you spill or let some fall." Another particular example from 1766 at Colonial Williamsburg was addressed to friends. "A friend may taste, but don't waste." From the outside, puzzle jugs look relatively straightforward, but in fact, closer observation of the tubular lips you see at the top with the 3 sort of spouts coming out revealed a much more complicated internal mechanism. As the cross-section illustrations show here, the direction of the liquid was determined by a system of internal tubes, not visible on the outside of the vessel. Tricky indeed. Food, too, could be a source of trickery in ceramics. As trompe-l'oeil and illusionism became subjects of interest in the Rococo period, ceramic vessels followed suit. In particular, dishes made for the table were designed to fool the eye and whet the appetites of those sitting down to a meal. Visual tricks range from the small, such as the examples of insects, like flies and butterflies, that appeared to be crawling on the surface of the sophisticated white porcelain made at Meissen Manufactory, the first to produce true porcelain in Europe in 1710. Meissen became known in the 18th century for creating prized pieces of perfect porcelain. Yet the recipe for the white, translucent, and sonorous ceramic body was only recently discovered, and flaws were often found in the plates, vases, and other forms made at Meissen. Yet rather than throw out these pieces, decorators covered them with insects and flowers. And apologies for the blurry photo, but you'll see the 2 insects there are actually hiding flaws in the ceramic body. Though nobody wanted a fly in their soup, Meissen incorporated insects into useful forms of cover-up that transformed flaws into naturalistic compositions. Larger forms of trompe-l'oeil took place at the table in the mid-18th century at German porcelain factories such as Höchst, which began making fantasy terrines, platters, and plates that imitated game cooked for the table. Höchst was soon followed by Niederwiller and the Strasbourg factory of Paul Hanon, the latter of whom became well known for fooling diners with his extravagant trompe-l'oeil vessels and plates. Both manufactured everything from olives, cornichons, cherries, sliced eggs, to artichokes, And here you can see some examples from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Strasbourg. These tricky platters were made possible by the development of new colorful glazes that could better imitate a wider variety of things, and the usage of the muffle kiln, which allowed for the firing temperatures to be better controlled. Moreover, the appearance of large, elaborate dishes made in imitation of a diversity of foods was indicative of the culinary revolution that took place in the 18th century, led, of course, by France. Sauces developed by chefs dramatically improved the taste of otherwise bland foods, while elaborate services à la française transformed the table surface into an elaborately choreographed display filled with tablescapes. Recipes were shared by a literate consumer base who devoured cookbooks in order to impress their guests. This erudite culinary landscape gave ceramics makers an endless variety of dishes to play with. Vessels were thus made of cabbages, lettuce, apples, lemons, grouse, turkey, pheasant, duck, peacock, woodcock, and pigeon. Ducks, such as the one shown here, were often done in pairs in order to honor the symmetry of the tables served à la française. In addition to being beautifully decorated, they could be opened to contain steaming hot savory dishes. Perhaps among the most realistic and maybe least appealing was the boar's head terrine, which appears as if it's been sliced and ready to eat. It's believed that Jean-Guillaume Lantz first came up with the idea of imitating boar's heads while working in Strasbourg around 1754 to 55. The gruesome details of the glaze, from the bristly hairs of the beast to its glazed-over eye, tusks and tongue together form a feat of ceramics manufacturing that at the same time makes the stomach churn. Melons were apparently a favorite fruit for fooling hungry diners, as this example from Strasbourg in the Met's collection shows. According to Meredith Chilton, melons were prepared in multiple ways in the past, beyond the raw versions that we're familiar with today. For example, someone, either a genius or a fool, depending on your taste, thought it was a good idea to make melon fritters. Nicolas de Bonfons, in his garden treatise, wrote in 1684 that with melons, quote, you can also cut them into slices and dip them into a batter made with wheat flour, eggs, soft cheese, and other ingredients. Then they are fried in fresh butter or lard, and when they are taken out of the pan, you powder them with salt or sugar, according to the taste of those to whom they are served. Orange juice or lemon, verjuice or a little vinegar is the best sauce for all fritters. I caution you to not try this recipe at home. Oh, sorry, so this is an excerpt from his book. But perhaps one of the most horrifying recipes from the past came from the 18th century and also concerned melons. Except this was, appropriately for us today, a recipe for making trompe-l'oeil melons. Apparently, Elizabeth Moxon, author of the 1741 publication, English Housewifery, exemplified in above 400 receipts never before printed, giving directions in most parts of cookery and how to prepare various sorts of soups, made dishes, pastes, pickles, cakes, creams, jellies, made wines, etc., with sculptures for the orderly placing the dishes and courses, and also bills of fare for every month in the year, was sorely disappointed that melons did not grow well in colder climes. She therefore offered the following recipe for making an artificial melon. Take some lean sausage meat, color it green with spinach juice, then roll it out, quote, to an inch thick and pressing it into a melon mold, end quote. The inside, she suggested, could be stuffed with stewed oysters. This would be boiled in a cloth, quote, until you think it is enough, end quote. The fake melon would then be topped off with some oyster sauce. Of course, forms of visual illusion extended beyond the realm of food. Niederwiller and Strasbourg, as well as German factories such as Nymphenburg, pushed the limits of the ceramic medium by creating a series of faux bois or false wood wares. These included coffee pots, platters, and trays, including the examples on view in the exhibition. On the one hand, these pieces represent feats of painterly skill. They demonstrate that ceramics decorators not only could fool you into thinking ceramic was wood, but could reproduce the reproductive prints that middle-class people began hanging on their walls as a sign of cultural refinement and sophistication. In a truly meta-meta narrative, you could hang the ceramic plate with the print and a part of the wall on the wall. On the other hand, these faux bois plates play on the economic values associated with ceramics. In the 18th century, only the poor used wooden plates to eat off of. Using ceramics for tableware rather than the humble material of wood signaled that one was moving up in the world and capable of leaving a past of penury behind. Using plates that imitated wood meant that one was secure enough in one's status to make fun of that past. This elaborate self-conscious play in the materiality of ceramics thus carried with it deeper questions of money and class, and the tensions between the haves and the have-nots, issues that were perhaps at the heart of trompe-l'oeil more broadly. Trompe-l'oeil was just as much about deception and disappointment as it was about wishful thinking and wish fulfillment. No matter how skillful the decoration or elegant the design, there's no doubt that encountering a trompe-l'oeil plate on an empty stomach brought with it mixed feelings, perhaps heightening the effects of the illusions through the sense of disappointment and realizing that the enticing picture was, in fact, just a picture and not a real bunch of grapes. Is it any wonder that in the time of the French Revolution, when wars ravaged on, inflation was at an all-time high, and money and food were scarce, ceramics makers began decorating plates with the new French money known as the assignat, catering to a new republic and its citizens hungry for a prosperous future. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. I actually haven't had lunch yet. I think I'm going to pass on the melon. I'm also reminded of the wonderful ceramic vessels by two contemporary artists, Bertozzi and Cassoni, who do these wonderful work now with tableware done that in completely deceptive trompe-l'oeil. Our next speaker, Eleanor Soo-ah Hyun, is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, completing a dissertation on late imperial Joseon Korea and Qing Dynasty art. As of 2015, Eleanor worked at the British Museum as the first curator for the Korean collections. And in 2019, she joined the Met as an associate curator for Korean art. You can currently see her exhibition, Rites and Rituals, on view in the Art of Korea Gallery here. And this, in the fall of 2023, on the 25th anniversary of that gallery, she opens Lineages and Legacies, celebrating acquisitions alongside modern and contemporary Korean art. Her talk today, Treasures and Fantasies, Illusionism in Qing Chinese and Joseon Korean Art, expands the purview of our current exhibition, which is devoted to trompe-l'oeil in Europe and the United States. In her fascinating view onto 18th and 19th century Chinese and Korean art, Eleanor reveals how merchants and missionaries circulated Western forms of illusionistic representation throughout Asia. Chinese and Korean artists, in turn, selectively incorporated linear perspective and illusionism in their works. Illusionistic objects were admired both for their technical achievement and for the puns and witticisms that they conveyed.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Mimi and Mariana, for inviting me to participate in this Sunday at the Met. The phrase at the top of the slide opens the famous 18th century Qing Chinese novel, Dream of the Red Chamber. Truth becomes fiction when the fiction's true. Real becomes not real when the unreal's real. Try saying that 5 times fast. It poetically captures the ambiguous and antonymic aspects of illusionism that are embodied in the objects that I'll be discussing today. The play between fiction and truth, real and unreal, was a common theme in East Asian aesthetics and literature. The playfulness and the technical achievement of illusionism arguably reached its height in the 18th century. While illusionism is found throughout Asia, due to the limits of time, I will briefly talk about Qing China and Joseon Korea. On the left is a late 18th, early 19th century Joseon Korean 8-panel folding screen, and on the right is a mid-18th century Qing Chinese enamel jar. Illusionism and mimesis were enjoyed as sensory spectacle and as effective metaphors. Both these objects employ motif commonly found in Illusionism, a textile. The Korean painting uses the classic trope of a curtain unveiling, which is, in this painting that we've seen now a couple of times. On the right, similarly, a curtain is used in the 18th century Chinese enamel. Sorry. Let's briefly look at Illusionism in Qing China. Before delving in, I wanted to show this painting that is currently on view in the exhibition Noble Virtues in the second floor Chinese painting galleries to provide some background. This is a detail of an 18th century hand scroll, so contemporaneous to the previous objects. And it's a great example of a millennia-long tradition of ink painting and calligraphy that was considered the highest form of representation in East Asia. As you can see, image and text coexist in the visual field, and text can take various forms from different calligraphic styles to seal impressions. Amid this cultural landscape comes Western perspective and illusionism, introduced predominantly through Jesuit missionaries who act as advisors and painters for the Qing emperors. This theater hall is a tour de force of illusionism. It is located in the Palace of Tranquil Longevity that was built in the late 18th century as retirement quarters for the Qianlong emperor. On the ceiling are wisteria hanging from bamboo lattice, and on the north wall, an elaborate courtyard scene with crane and flowers seen through a moon gate and a bamboo lattice fence. All of this is painted. The artifice of the painting is accentuated by real, actual architectural elements that align with the painted imagery, such as the pillars and a bamboo fence on the opposite wall. Illusionism was not contained to walls or paintings, but also found on three-dimensional surfaces, as we saw in the first image, again shown here. These 18th century enamel jars are a pair and are currently on view in the excellent exhibition entitled Embracing Color on the third floor Chinese Decorative Arts Galleries. The textile is the illusionistic device. The enameling is painted to look as if a scarf-like textile is wrapped around a jar. Everything about this jar is ornate. This textile seems to be haphazardly wrapped with unfurled folds and a single loop bow. All of these details, from the motifs to the folds in the textiles, are there to show off technical prowess in enamel painting. As the Embracing Color exhibition discusses, there were advancements in enamel techniques that allowed for subtle brushwork, gradations in color, and the ability to paint shadows. So with these advancements, Qing artisans flaunted their skillfulness. These two objects show that illusionism was not limited to surfaces. Both are from the 18th century and are in the National Palace Museum, Taipei. They are widely popular, and one has to queue to actually see them. On the left is a jasper stone that is carved to look like dongpo ro, pork belly delicacy of Hangzhou. It's a good thing I followed Iris in her talk. And on the right is jadeite carved to look like bok choy with a locust and cricket hidden within the green leaves. These are both small. The pork belly stone is only 2¼ inches tall. Again, like the enamel jars, this is flaunting technical mastery. Mastery utilizing and manipulating the material aspects of the jasper and the jadeite to manipulate the viewer into thinking these are not jasper or jadeite. And the manipulation and deception are supposed to be amusing. Hence, for the palace interior, it seems fitting that the illusionistic wall and ceiling paintings are in the theater hall, a place where performers would be acting out fictions. Back to these two amusing objects, these types of illusionistic objects could be displayed in a duobaoge, literally a many treasure shelf, as seen here. A duobaoge is a display shelf that is itself decorative, having offset asymmetrical shelving. Gallery 219 is called the Chinese Treasury, and the display cases take their inspiration from duobaoge, and the objects are arranged as if it was a Qing interior. I know that Gallery 219 is off the beaten path, so I encourage all of you to go see it if you haven't already. It's a small gallery, but a real gem, and the objects are made out of a vast array of materials, and they illustrate the highest levels of skill, ingenuity, and aesthetics of the Qing dynasty. It really is worth seeing, and so you should go there in person, and while you're up there, you can see the Embracing Color exhibition as well. The Doalbalga is a good segue to Illusionism in Chosun Korea because it is in this type of painting that Chosun painters wholly embraced and implemented Western techniques of linear perspective and volumetric shading to create an illusion of a shelf holding objects. With the prominence of books, these are called bookshelves, but with the offset asymmetrical shelving, these paintings are depicting a Doalbalga, a treasure shelf. This 8-panel folding screen clearly shows two signature conventions of Illusionism. The first, the rolled-up curtain to reveal the spectacle of a full shelf behind it, and less obvious is in the lower right, an open panel revealing books inside. The panel cover leans against the shelf and comes toward the pictorial threshold into the viewer's space, another signature convention of illusionistic painting. This type of painting is called a munbangdo, and as a painting of objects, it's a still life painting genre. It's important to note that unlike in the West, still life painting was not a prevalent genre in East Asia. Thus, the emergence of munbangdo indicates an interesting development in Korean painting history. A development that is the result of global interactions in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries between Qing China, Edo Japan, and Western missionaries and merchants. In a brief introduction to these paintings, I'll answer the who, what, when, and why. What are these paintings? During the Chosun Dynasty, Korea's last dynastic period that spanned 500 years, objects related to learning were particularly popular because the dynasty established Neo-Confucianism as the official state ideology. Royals and elites were expected to be scholars, well-versed in Confucian classics and literary aesthetics. In depicting books and other objects related to and found in a scholar's study called a munbang, this genre is historically referred to as a munbangdo, painting of a scholar's study. When were these painted? Historical records reveal that munbangdo was established as a genre by the 1780s, so it likely started in the mid-1700s. And it continued to be popular through the 19th and into the 20th century until the Korean War. Since the 2000s, there's been a resurgence in the interest of these paintings, and now many contemporary artists are finding inspiration in creating new munbangdo-inspired works. Who painted these and who used them? Court painters were regularly tested on their ability to paint specific subjects, such as landscape, ink bamboo, flower, etc. King Jongjo, one of the most important kings of the Chosun dynasty, who reigned from 1776 to 1800, had munbangdo added to the court paintings examination. So we know that King Jongjo and his successors had munbangdos created to display in the palaces. Moving beyond the palace, Yangban elites also commissioned munbangdo paintings. Its popularity continues to trickle down to the next class of jungin, who are technocrats, and merchants. These two groups grow in wealth and stature in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then by the 20th century, munbangdo paintings of varying quality are being produced and consumed throughout every level of society. So it started with the king and court painters and then gradually moved beyond the palace walls. Why and how were they used? Usually mounted in a folding screen format, these paintings were admired for their pictorial forms along with their practical function. The multi-panel screens are collapsible, easily moved and stored. Folding screens would be placed as decorative backdrops during banquets and rituals, also used as room dividers, and in the winter were situated in front of windows to block the wind and cold. How did Chosun Koreans learn about Western Illusionism? By the 18th century, Western-style painting was known in East Asia and was being practiced by some painters. Chosun painters encountered Western images from various sources. Some court painters were part of envoy teams to Beijing, and while in Beijing, they saw Western painting, visited Catholic cathedrals, and interacted with Westerners. And those Chosun painters who did not travel could see Western images through prints that circulated throughout the region. Hong Dae-young, a Yangban elite, a scholar official, accompanied Chosun envoys to Beijing in 1765. And here are his comments after visiting Beijing's observatory that had been decorated by Jesuit painters. While waiting for Mr. Liu and Mr. Bao, I looked around at the paintings on the walls on both sides. Figures and a pavilion were all constructed of colors masterfully. The center of the pavilion was empty and concave, and pointed parts blend into one another nicely. Figures were moving and floating in the air as if alive. Above all, the painting excels in perspective. Streams and valleys at times emerge or fade away. Vapors and clouds at times shine or darken. Even to the faraway limits of the sky, correct colors were applied. Browsing through the painting, it reminded me of real scenery, while not realizing that I'm looking at a painting. They say that the principles behind Western paintings are not only outstanding thoughts, but also methods of planning and dividing, which all come from mathematics. Hong is taken in by the illusionistic imagery, but he ends with the understanding that the visual illusion is from mathematics. It's a technique. King Jeongjo's admiration for Munbangdo painting is known not only because he ordered court painters to produce them and be tested in the genre, but also from historical anecdotes, such as this one from 1791. Side note, while I'm showing this painting with the quote, this is not the painting in the quote. Looking at the bookshelf behind the throne, His Majesty, King Jeongjo, asked his officials, "Do you see them?" They answered, "Yes, we see them." Then His Majesty laughed and said, "They're not real books, but a painting." There are a couple of interesting aspects from this quote. The first is the power dynamic, which is always present since he is the king. But there is this knowledge and power discrepancy between the king who knows the trick of illusionistic painting and his subjects who do not. The king tests them and then laughs at their inability to discern what they are seeing. The king is in the know. If one never saw illusionistic painting, the misidentification is understandable. More so due to the placement of the Munbangdo, the second interesting aspect of this anecdote. The screen is placed behind the throne, a location of privilege since it acted as the backdrop to the king. The screen framed the king as seen in the image on the right. The most common screen that was behind the throne is the sun, moon, and 5 peaks, shown here on the left. This type of screen was only allowed for the king, and thus it was synonymous with the king. It is the opposite of illusionistic painting. None of the natural elements look like they do in nature. It's all very flat and graphic, but it's about the symbolic meaning of these elements and the king's central place in the universe. Thus, one can understand the king's subject's confusion that a Munbangdo screen painting would be placed behind the throne. For the king, it wasn't only about illusionism, but also about the symbolism and the metaphor that the Munbangdo screen has. King Jeongjo gives the illusionistic image a sensory efficacy, elucidated by this quote from 1798. King Jeongjo says, "Great scholars of the past said that if one occasionally entered one's study and touched one's desk, it satisfied the mind, even though one was unable to read books regularly. Although I take pleasure in reading books, hard work keeps me from indulging in scholarly pursuits. I remember the words of the sages and look at this painting and enjoy myself. Isn't this a wise thing to do? It doesn't matter when or where. Rulers and kings are so self-congratulatory." But this quote is revealing. The king not only enjoys the painting for their visual trickery, as we described in the earlier anecdote, but also for learning and remembering something through these paintings. He remembers the wise words of the sages, the osmosis effect of being in a study, of being around books. Gosh, if only, I wish there was this osmosis effect. And I really wished it when I was a student. The king gives the painting an effective power. It is a conduit of the pleasures of reading. It's a conduit of indulging in scholarly pursuits. In equating looking at illusionistic Munbangdo to touching a desk and thus satisfying the mind, he adds the reason for desiring illusionism. While touching will reveal that these are images and not real books, the effective power is in looking like real books. And if anything, it all the more aligns with the fiction of osmosis that King Jeongjo is spinning. These illusionistic Munbangdo also have a surprising element for Joseon court painting, the identity of the painter. While this may not be surprising for Western painting, Korean court painters did not sign their works, but some illusionistic Munbangdo have signatures, such as this one by court painter Lee Eung-nok, and it is illusionism that allowed for a signature. The reason is similar to the signatures on these paintings included in the Cubism exhibition. As Mimi Braun writes in the catalog, quote, "Signatures become a privileged instrument of artifice," end quote. They're playfully embedded on correspondence. They are made to look like engraved names on visiting cards and so forth. Similarly, the court painters embed their names to make the objects look real. And in this case, it is making the base of a seal chop look real. So here's a box with seals, and the red square is the underside of a chop. and where a name would be carved, the underside of the chop where the name would be carved. And on the red square are characters of the name of the court painter Iung-nok. Unlike Western painters, the chosen court painters do not look for other areas to embed their signatures. There are no signatures on other objects that would be logical to have text, such as title slips on scrolls or the title slips on books. On seal chops, the court painters only include their names and not someone else's. This may be because of what a seal is, the most official form of a signature. A seal impression of one's name was more official than a signature in ink. Thus, in adding characters to make the seal chop as illusionistic as possible, would court painters feel comfortable writing somebody else's name, taking and inserting another's identity? Could this be a form of identity theft, thus taking this fiction a step too far? The court painter's signature is less likely about insertion of the self and more about keeping up with the illusion, and the court painters painted their names on seal chops out of propriety. By the mid-late 19th century, bookshelf munbangdo become more graphic and less illusionistic, as seen in this 8-panel screen. In addition to munbangdo, I think I might have gone up. Nope, correct. In addition to munbangdo, paintings of leopard skin curtains were popular for a short period, and they too were illusionistic. This screen originally depicted only a curtain, and at a later point, the 5th and 6th panels, counting from the right, was altered. A portion was cut out, and the still life munbangdo imagery was inserted using the unveiling curtain trope. But if you look at the still life portion, while there are aspects of spatial recession and volumetric shading, the unveiled interior is very flat, and the objects are more graphically rendered. But it is still about symbolism and spectacle. In this late 19th century bookshelf munbangdo, there's no spatial depth, and the spectacle is all about the sheer number and the abundance of books. This late 19th and early 20th century example takes the flatness even further. Sets of books are placed on top of each other with other scholars' objects scattered throughout. The patterns of the book covers and the various angles creates overlapping and divergent lines, which is then further contrasted by the bookshelf lines in orange, which was added later. This is a complete departure from illusionism, but not from spectacle. So illusionism loses its effective power, especially as more and more people can discern the visual tricks. But still life paintings are continuously desired for their symbolic meanings of the objects in the abundance and the overabundance of objects. I didn't have time to go into it here, but there is a lot of visual punning in munbangdo. Thus, in the 19th century, bookcase munbangdo are produced in fewer number and more stacked munbangdo are produced, such as these. And here's another example. Though the genre begins with illusionism, it breaks away, and then it moves to graphic, flat imagery that still maintain and convey the auspicious symbols and the rebuses that were found in the earlier forms. While it may not be illusionism to cubism, there are some interesting parallels, and I'll stop here. Lastly, as a shameless plug for other Met projects, since I wasn't able to go into all the symbolism and the rebuses, I'll refer you to 2 resources on the Met's website about Korean munbangdo. So there's an Insider Insights video, and then there's an essay on the timeline of art history. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Gallery 219 just is an example of the treasure hunt that one can undertake here at the Met in different galleries and departments for a variety of objects and trompe-l'oeil. Our last speaker today, Thayer is the Marica F. Vilcek Curator of American Paintings and Sculptures at the Met's American Wing. Thayer oversees the Met's American Sculpture Collection, for which she edited and co-authored the 2-volume catalog, which was published in 1999 and 2001. Among her exhibitions were the 2009 Augustin St. Gaudens in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American West in Bronze, 1850 to 1925, which was held over the 2-year period 2013 to 15. She also contributed to the museum's recent 2020 anniversary exhibition, Making the Met, and is co-curator of New York Art World's 1870 to 1890, which has just opened in the American Wing and which you can enjoy after our program today. Dr. Toll's talk brings her back to her scholarly origins, because she began her career at the Met in 1989 as a research assistant for the 1992 exhibition on the American trompe-l'oeil painter William Harnett. Entitled Painted Like Real Things, American Trompe-l'oeil Painting at the Met, her talk today considers the longer development of this specialized genre within the history of still life painting, the Met's acquisitions in this area, and her personal favorites in the collection.
Thank you, Mimi. And sitting here waiting to speak, I thought there is a benefit to going last, which is that my colleagues in their excellent talks have set up a number of visual and narrative through lines that I'm going to keep an eye out for them. Not to make it a game, but just, you'll see. I'm delighted to be here today representing the American Wing, so many thanks to Mimi and Mariana for including me. And in turn, I'd like to say how pleased we are in the American Wing to have two works featured in the groundbreaking exhibition, Cubism and the Trompe-l'oeil Tradition. Indeed, the inclusion of American trompe-l'oeil painting in the show epitomizes how we at the Met are committed to looking at our collections through expanded lenses, opening the aperture on visual and cultural relationships across space and time. That strategy is encapsulated in the graphic identity for the exhibition that pairs Georges Braque's violin and sheet music with William Harnett's still life violin and music. As Mimi and Lizzie have observed in the exhibition and its catalog, it's unlikely that Cubist artists were more than passingly aware, if that, of American trompe-l'oeil painters. But here, presented side by side, their compositional similarities serve as a jumping-off point for fertile lines of inquiry about imitation, deception, narrative, and artistic self-fashioning. As Mimi mentioned, I served as the research assistant for the Met's 1992 exhibition on William Harnett, the leading exemplar of late 19th century American trompe-l'oeil painters. Since then, and I'm feeling my age because it's 30 years ago, while I went off to in pursuit of the third dimension, there's been an explosion of insightful writing about American trompe-l'oeil painting, from PhD dissertations to articles, books, and exhibition catalogs. And here I particularly want to call out important recent work by Nika Elder on Harnett. Her book has just been published, and Amy Werbel on John Haberly. And I'm proud to say that both of these authors have been fellows in the American Wing. So over the next few minutes, I'll distill some ideas about late 19th century American trompe-l'oeil painting that represent only the tip of the iceberg about long pondered issues of art and reality, truth and illusion. Let's see, there we go. Much has been debated about American trompe-l'oeil artists and the degree to which they intended virtuoso technique to visually and by extension psychologically deceive. Bear in mind, this was an era when popular entertainment featured such impresarios as P.T. Barnum, who delighted in all forms of showmanship and con games. Some artists engaged with their audiences more cunningly and directly. Here are a couple of examples in which art seems to become a participatory act. In Chalfant's Which is on view in this exhibition, the artist has pasted an actual 4-cent US postal stamp onto the canvas, pairing it with a hand-painted imitation with identical sawtooth edges. The fake newspaper clipping painted at lower right challenges the viewer to ponder, which is the real one? We see that the stamp at left is handled and rubbed, acknowledgement of the irresistible urge viewers may feel to touch and verify deception. And I've got to say, when we were installing the Harnett exhibition, it was really, really hard not to want to touch everything. Likewise, on the right, Scott Evans invites us to reach into the cavity on the wooden board and sample a new variety of almond. The broken glass and nuts extended into the viewer's space imply that at least one passerby has attempted just that, risking injury for nourishment. Harnett and his trompe-l'oeil contemporaries flourished for 2 decades beginning in the late 1870s. Most had traditional artistic training. For his part, Harnett at academies in Philadelphia and New York, and then he spent 6 years working in Europe. Each artist made a self-conscious decision to pursue still life painting, depicting inanimate objects in an illusionistic style, aware that the conventional hierarchy of genres placed still life on the lowest rung, well below history painting, landscape, and portraiture. These painters stood largely aside from the cosmopolitan artists and critics who dominated the art scene in the 1880s and 90s, and indeed these are the artists that are represented in New York Art Worlds, which just opened in the American Wing. So it's fair to say that the trompe-l'oeil work appealed to a more diverse popular audience that encountered paintings not only in art exhibitions, but also in industrial fairs, retail establishments, hotel lobbies, factories, bars, and restaurants. In works such as After the Hunt, Harnett demonstrates his capacity for extraordinary verisimilitude in an imposing life-size rendering of dead game and hunting gear suspended against a wood door. When one newspaper writer encountered the monumental painting hanging in Theodore Stewart's New York Street Saloon on Warren Street, he wrote, quote, "It does not look like a picture at all. It seems to be a real door on which hang some birds, a hare, a sword, a hunting cap, and gun, all so real that they apparently cast shadows upon the wooden background." Pictures like John Haberley's imitation on view in Cubism and trompe-l'oeil should be appreciated as illusionistic feats of painting intended to enthrall and confuse audiences and to press the question, does an ultra-realistic painting of paper bills imply it's an actual counterfeit? The title, Imitation, asserts not. Likewise, Haberley signed this small work 3 times and added his self-portrait as if to over-assert his authorship. Imitation also nods to the complexities of conspicuous spending and materialism associated with the so-called Gilded Age. These paintings have much to say about the country at the time. The material objects depicted, both individually and in dialogue with each other, become barometers of cultural significance, and beyond that, national mood and values in the post-Civil War years. You may ask who purchased American trompe-l'oeil paintings. We know they were mainly self-made middle-class merchants and manufacturers. By the turn of the 20th century, that market had largely dried up as aesthetic taste pivoted elsewhere. Harnett and his contemporaries didn't enter the so-called canon of traditional Euro-American art history until the mid-20th century. They were rediscovered in the mid-1930s, an era, incidentally, when Surrealist, Dada, and Cubist artworks were also favored by American collectors, dealers, and museums, warming to abstraction and visual sleights of hand. So to condense this narrative, the first Harnett to enter a museum collection was in 1935 to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And over the next several decades, many more were institutionally placed. The collecting of American trompe-l'oeil painting here at the Met was very much part of this phenomenon. The curator at the time, and acquisitions are in some measure reflective of subjective curatorial taste, brought in what remains our core holdings in these decades. Our 5 Harnett paintings entered the collection between 1956 and 1973. 3 were purchases, New York Daily News was a gift, and Still Life was a bequest. Collectively, they represent the range of Harnett's work, from more intimate bric-a-brac-laden tabletops to the vertical letter racks and boards with inanimate objects, all strategically selected and placed. Some feature familiar models that Harnett owned and used repeatedly and that were included in his estate sale. The case of our 3 paintings by John Peto is more complex, since both the Old Cremona, purchased in 1939, and Old Souvenirs, bequeathed in 1968, bear Harnett's signature. So back to the importance of signatures. By the late 1940s, the leading trompe-l'oeil scholar, Alfred Frankenstein, had determined that a group of paintings attributed to Harnett bore his false signature. Moreover, they were executed in a distinctly softer, more painterly style with flattened forms and variant signatures. What ensued was a detective project sorting out the real Harnetts, whose work was then seen as more marketable than from the others. Many were the hand of his acquaintance, John Peto, who, like Harnett, had Philadelphia roots and academic training. While he was influenced by Harnett's compositions and vice versa, to be sure, he was not involved in the forgeries. Peto's body of work is entirely distinctive for its style, palette, and choice of models. So someone else was doing it. The Old Cremona, purchased in 1939 as a Harnett, was reattributed to Peto in the late 1940s. It was followed by the purchase of Office Board as an autograph Peto in 1955. Rounding out our core holdings are these 3 paintings purchased between 1965 and 70. Haberle's A Bachelor's Drawer had remained in his family until 1966 when his daughter sold it. The painting entered the Met's collection in 1970 after being lent by a private collector to the museum's landmark centennial exhibition, 19th Century America. Both Chalfant and Pope were inspired by Harnett's example and emulated his trompe-l'oeil compositions. However, in the case of the old, or I want to call it the old oak door, but it's the oak door, purchased in 1965, Pope relied on truth as illusion, since rather than simulating the grain of an oak door, he painted directly on an oak panel and added an oak frame. It's the clever paradox. The real thing becomes part of the overall artifice. Today, the American Wing continues to strategically collect trompe-l'oeil works. For instance, this incredible watercolor of 4 flies at left represents a departure from rendering animate rather than human-made objects. This is by the Hartford-based African-American artist Charles Ethan Porter and is the partial and promised gift of Charlene and Warren Goines. And high on our acquisition wish list, you always have to get that word out, is a work by the accomplished woman painter Claude Hurst, a New York-based contemporary of Harnett's. She's best known for her precisely rendered tabletop still lifes, centered on stereotypical masculine pursuits, in this instance, drinking and gambling. So now we're going to take a closer look at 3 Met paintings, starting with Harnett's still life, violin, and music. Harnett's status as an Irish immigrant born in 1848 and brought to Philadelphia as a child is key to an assessment of this painting. So too is an understanding of his dual goals: to create paintings in a hyper-realistic style and to enliven them with narrative. In an interview published in the New York News in 1889 or 90 titled "Painted Like Real Things, the Man Whose Pictures Are a Wonder and a Puzzle," Harnett succinctly reflected, quote, "I endeavor to make the composition tell a story." Whether the resulting story is autobiographical or nods to patrons' tastes and identities, many of his still life paintings lend themselves to personal interpretation. Here, this vertical composition is remarkably full of depth. The centerpiece is a violin suspended on a string from a nail against a hinged door that is slightly ajar, thus inviting the viewer to ponder what lies beyond the cast shadows. The rosin-dusted violin, bow, and piccolo reappear in other Harnett paintings and no doubt belong to him. This torn and stained sheet music alludes to his Irish-American identity, It's a melancholy ballad from Thomas More's collection Irish Melodies, titled St. Kevin, or By That Lake Whose Gloomy Shore. It's a 19th century adaptation of a 6th century Irish legend of passion and murder. Harnett faithfully painted the original score with keyboard introduction. Yet for all the attention that Harnett and others give to eradicating the artist's hand in order to convey illusion, they did from time to time build up paint for tactile effect. Here in the case of the turned up lower right corner of the calling card. It's tucked into a crack between 2 planks and doubles as Harnett's signature on the painting. It's misleading to call John Peto an illusionistic trompe-l'oeil painter, strictly speaking, given his predilection for softly delineated contours and painterly application of pigment. Yet his choice of subject matter, tabletops with decorative objects, doors hanging with musical instruments, and racks holding paper ephemera aligns with that and Harnett and Haberle. In works such as Old Souvenirs, Peto entices the viewer with visual clues that are meant to engage and arouse curiosity, if not always offer answers. Some of the objects tucked behind the strips of tape are dated, the newspaper 1881, the postmark on the envelope 1887. Others are able to be dated, offering us indication of the long time span on which the artist worked on this painting, nearly 20 years. For instance, the photo of Peto's daughter Helen at upper left was probably added over another portrait around 1900 when she was 7 years old. And we know this because of modern conservation and infrared reflectography. The newspaper clipping at the upper right encourages us to lean in and read, only to discover up close its frustratingly illegible gibberish. Peto also delighted in another form of trickery, wordplay. Here, at the same time, he promises and withholds important information inside a torn and nailed envelope. Well, if Harnett and Peto's paintings have their personal elements, Haberle's A Bachelor's Drawer may be seen as the most autobiographical of the three and laced with irony and humor as well. You're not looking at the interior of the drawer, but rather the vertical front minus its handles. I thought for years it was the inside of the drawer, and then I was corrected. Various items are arranged on it that through word and image commemorate the freedoms of a bachelor's lifestyle. Here we see torn theater stubs, lottery tickets, playing cards, a corncob pipe currency, a cigar box lid, a smoldering cigarette, and a strategically censored photograph of a female nude. It was around the same time that Haberle began working on this painting in 1890 that he met his future wife, and they were married in 1892. A drawing of a dandied, mustachioed gentleman, is it Haberle himself, points at the pamphlet How to Name the Baby. And below it, a photo of a wailing infant is surrounded by cards of pinups. These allude to his newly domesticated lifestyle as a husband and father, since in 1894, the same year Haberle completed this painting, his first daughter was born. Does the imprint of the horseshoe at the top center suggest his luck as a swinging single has run out? And lastly, to reinforce the self-referential narrative, Haberle includes a tin-type self-portrait tucked in the bottom edge. There's far more to decipher in this complex painting than time allows, particularly about issues of censorship and temporality. So I would like to encourage you to go to the paintings page on our website for a link to an excellent recent article by Amy Werbel in the Metropolitan Museum Journal, or to use a trompe-l'oeil metaphor. Much remains to discover behind a partially open door. So I hope this brief introduction to the Met's collection of American trompe-l'oeil paintings has whetted your appetite to undertake a visual treasure hunt by exploring their presence in Cubism and trompe-l'oeil, as well as in Gallery 763 in the American Wing, where each location they can be appreciated in broader context. Thank you so much.
So no one is getting up to leave, which means that you just don't want to go. But that's the end of our incredible program today. I want to thank our 4 fabulous speakers, and I want to thank our audience for coming out. And I hope you will return to the exhibition and to the many galleries that you caught a glimpse of today in our presentations. Pito's little envelope, important information inside, is really a cue to the whole trompe-l'oeil game. There is so much important information inside these paintings and objects that we hope that you will sleuth through. Thank you very much again for coming.